Hello, and welcome to Catholic Answers Live. Thanks for being with us on a Friday afternoon, or maybe a Friday evening, or if you're our good friend James in the Philippines, listening on a Saturday morning, or anybody over there on the other side of the date line listening on a Saturday morning. Thanks for being here with us. If you're within range of a phone and you got a question, this is going to be a good deal for you because Jimmy Akin is here. 2 hours of open forum, 888-318-7884. Whatever your question is, it is welcome here, 888-318-7884. And if you haven't listened before, please be advised, you don't have to be Catholic. You don't have to be religious in any way. If you have a question about Catholic faith or Catholic people or anything else, you're welcome. 888-318-7884. Jimmy Akin, of course, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers, one of the featured speakers at next week's Catholic Answers conference, and the author of A Daily Defense and The Bible is a Catholic Book and many other things. Hello, Jimmy Akin.
Hello, Cyril Kellett. How are you doing?
I'm very well. I got the Cyril Kellett today.
Well, sure. Why not? Yeah. It's Friday. I can be a little generous.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, Cyril. More and more people call me Cyril. I like it. It. Maybe because when you get older, you settle into a name like Cyril a little more. I don't know.
I could call you by the Greek version of it, Kyrillos.
Yes, that'd be fine. As a matter of fact, yes. Yeah. Please do that from now on.
Okay. Yeah, well, no. that was the name of one of the recent Coptic popes.
Oh, I didn't know that. I actually missed that. I know that the head of the Russian Orthodox Church is Kirill. Mm-hmm. All of which comes from the word for Lord or lordly, I think, in Greek, something like that. All those.
I'd have to check the etymology. I can see how it could be related to kurios, which is the word for Lord in Greek, but I'd want to check because folk etymologies can be dangerous.
Yeah, that's right. So I've never actually looked it up. I've just been told that, and I thought, I'll take it. I'll take lordly. 888-318-7884, 888-318-7884. Jimmy, as you know, I become unstuck in time sometimes when I'm doing pre-records, and it doesn't help when I open the document here and it says Friday, November 10th for today's show. That must have been a pre-record we did earlier today. 888-318-7884, the number.
They're changing it now. They're airbrushing it to the phone number.
Yep, that's right. It's all been, as they say, memory hold. It's gone down the memory hole. Jimmy, today you did the episode on reincarnation studies, and that's theories. Yeah, that was part of a two-part. Did you get any feedback yet, or wait for that to roll?
I've gotten some feedback from YouTube commenters who've already been commenting on YouTube, and that's been good. I also just today I'd had the scripts for last week's episode on reincarnation research and this week's script on reincarnation theories. I'd had them vetted by one of the major current reincarnation researchers, a gentleman named Dr. James Matlock. And so, as normal, when I release an episode that someone helped with, I send them a link and say, hey, this episode that you helped with is up. Thank you very much. And so I sent him a link today, and I also sent links to a couple of additional parapsychologists who I know have an interest in the subject, and at least one of whom's written about it. And I've already gotten back a response saying, hey, I'm really looking forward to seeing this, and maybe we can chat once I've had a chance to go through it. So I'm looking forward to getting some feedback from folks in the field.
Yeah. I'd be interested to hear what people have to say, because I know you have your own developed theory now about what might be going on there. And I'd be interested to hear what people who've been thinking about this for a long time think about that new theory. Again, the number is 888-318-7884. There's 2 lines open right now. That means we've got 4 callers ready to go. So we'll start in St. Louis, Missouri. Tyler is in St. Louis, Missouri, listening on the Catholic Answers Live app. Tyler, thank you for the call. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hello.
Hello.
So my question today is, I became Catholic last year, so I've been a Catholic for about a year now, and I come from a Southern Baptist background, so a lot of my family is Southern Baptist, and a lot of them lean Calvinist. So I've done a lot of research just through Catholic.com and a lot of other places as well. But I wanted to ask you, Jimmy, just kind of some strategies or maybe best practices when dealing with Calvinist objections to the Catholic faith.
Well, so the question is phrased in a rather general form, but in terms of general strategies that would work, a lot of them would be the same as interacting with anybody's objections. One thing to do is always be polite, be charitable, be generous, don't feel threatened. You just have a disagreement, and it doesn't need to be a cause of stress. It all are also asking questions of the person to make sure you understand what are their objections precisely, because you don't want to waste your time and theirs by responding to something that's not their actual objection. So you want to be sure you carefully identify exactly what this person's objection is, not what other Calvinists' objections are, but what this person's is. And then you want to address that. And it's obviously helpful to do some advanced research in that regard. One thing that I would recommend, if you haven't already checked it out as part of the research you've done, is an article that I did. It's published under various names. One of them is A Tiptoe Through Tulip, but if you just Google Jimmy Akin and Tulip, you'll come up with the article. It's on my website, jimmyakin.com. And what I do in it is I look at how close a Catholic could get to Calvinism, in terms of what's permitted church teaching. And I even end up proposing a Thomistic understanding of the tulip formula. The tulip formula, for people who may not be aware, represents TULIP. It's 5 distinctive doctrines within Calvinism. And I propose Thomistic equivalents of those based on the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas that are in some cases identical and in other cases not identical, but similar to what Calvinists believe. I've always meant to write an article that explores the other end of the spectrum. How far away from Calvinism could you get and still remain a faithful Catholic? But I haven't done that yet. So those are the general strategies I'd recommend. Is there any particular Calvinist objection that you're currently looking at that you'd like some help with?
Well, I'd say, most of the conversations that I have, they bring up the elect and that, predestination is the main conversation that we have. So anything that you have that's helpful from that perspective.
Yeah. One of the things that I discovered a while back, because I did an extensive study of this, both in the Bible, both Old and New Testament, and in the writings of the early church fathers, is that there has been a significant shift in how the term elect is used today. And this is true not just in Calvinist circles, but it's also been true in Catholic circles. In contemporary theology, the term elect is normally used to refer to those individuals who will be saved on the last day. And so what happens is when Calvinists look at in the Bible and they see the word elect, or chosen, it's the same word, they read that modern meaning into it. But a while back, I did a study of the subject, and I discovered that there are basically no passages in Scripture that use the term in that way. Instead, the way that the term elect or chosen gets used in Scripture is to refer to those individuals who have a special relationship with God. Not that they're going to be saved on the last day, but they have a special relationship with God, some kind of special relationship. So it's a much broader term, and you can't read Calvinist doctrines out of passages referring to the elect. That doesn't mean the modern usage is wrong. It's not wrong. It's just not how the Bible is using the term, and we need to be sensitive to that. If you'd like to read the study I did, I have a short ebook that I published on Amazon. It's called Chosen by God. So if you search on Amazon for Chosen by God, Jimmy Akin, it'll turn up that and you can download it and read it on your Kindle. Also, I would mention that if you actually look at the passages that now one of the distinctive doctrines of Calvinists is what they call unconditional election. And this means, as you would know, Tyler, this means that without any other considerations, just based on God's choice alone, for example, not based on foreknowledge of what someone is going to do, God chooses a certain person to be saved on the last day. And because it's not based on foreknowledge or anything else other than God's choice, it's called unconditional election. Well, the number of passages in Scripture that actually refer to predestination are very, very small. There's a very small number of them. And the only one that deals with the election, with the predestination of an individual other than like Jesus, is in Romans. It's in Romans 8. And there, Paul says that those who God foreknew, he also predestined. And that immediately links predestination to foreknowledge. And so there are other ways Calvinists can interpret this verse, but just looking at the verbiage in the verse, Paul links predestination to foreknowledge. And so that would not tend to support an unconditional election view. So that's another thing that may be helpful for you.
And I am going to leave that there. Thank you very much for the call and for getting us started, Tyler. But we got to take that first break. We'll be right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Catch Catholic Answers Live anytime at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Are you a coffee drinker? If so, you can now enjoy a coffee roasted to perfection by the Carmelite monks of Wyoming. Delicious Mystic Monk coffee is roasted and prepared by monks in a hidden cloistered monastery and is available in over 25 varieties. All Mystic Monk coffees are works of perfection and labors of love. For more information on how to purchase Mystic Monk coffee, visit mysticmonkcoffee.com. That's mysticmonkcoffee.com.
This month's devotion is to Our Lady of Sorrows. We ask Mary to pray for us so that we can unite ourselves to her in her sorrow, in the hope that we will one day also share her joy in the triumph of her Son. Join in this devotion to Mary and strengthen our connection to Our Lady with rosaries, statues, bracelets, holy cards, prayer booklets, and more. Available at EWTNRC.com.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Thanks so much for being here with us. It's Open Forum this hour and next hour, both hours with Jimmy Akin, our guest. Your calls welcome, 888-318-7884. Lots of folks on the line. On we go. Jordan is in Columbus, Ohio. Jordan, thank you for waiting. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hello. I was wondering, I just recently decided to leave Protestantism, some fringe, multi-denominational type church, Pentecostalism, and the services are really different. My grandma started me out in the Catholic Church. I wasn't baptized Catholic, but I remember vague prayers with her. I was just sending out emails, actually. I've made it to 2 masses, and I've done some research. And it just feels right, but I don't know what to do during the service, during the sacraments. Obviously, I know I don't go up for the Eucharist.
Okay.
Not yet, anyway. But I don't know what the proper etiquette is for crossing myself for the Apostles' Creed prayers and the prayers and sacraments. Do I join in that if I know them? Do I wait until RCIA?
Okay, Jordan.
Okay, so it's not too complex. Anybody's welcome to pray along with the church. So if you already know a prayer, you're welcome to say it. Incidentally, the prayers are all going to be printed in a little book. It's typically a paperback book. It's often printed on newsprint, and it's often in the back of the pew in front of you. It's called a missalette. And in the missalette, it'll have both the prayers for the Mass, including the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, which are the two that Catholics use on Sundays. And it'll also have various hymns that may be sung. And so you can, I'd say, pick up next time you're at church, look in the missalette, leaf through it, find where they are in the Mass, and you can follow along. And anything that the people are directed to say, you can say with them. You can also look up the hymns, and they may be in the missalette, or they may be in another book called a hymnal that'll also be in the pew in front of you. But if you want, you can flip to the right hymn, and often the hymns will be printed in the numbers for the hymns will be printed in the bulletin. You could pick up a bulletin as you're coming into church. Or sometimes some churches have the hymns the words for the hymns actually printed in the bulletin. So if you want to sing along, you can do that. That's not a problem. In terms of the protocol for making the sign of the cross, well, it is not head and shoulders, knees and toes, but it's sort of now there's two ways of doing it. One way is common in the Latin church, which is probably the kind of church you're visiting. Another is common in some Eastern churches. I'm going to mention the Latin one, and I'm only going to mention the Latin one, not because the other one isn't interesting, but just because it could be confusing if I give them both. So the way that it's customary to do it in a Latin church is you touch your forehead, then you touch your chest, then you touch your left shoulder, and then you touch your right shoulder. So it's head, chest, left, right. And that's basically it. The Eastern way is the same, except you just flip the two shoulders. But in the West, it's common to do it from left to right, the same direction that we read in. That may help you remember it. But you're welcome to make the sign of the cross. You're welcome to sing. You're welcome to pray. You're welcome to say the creeds. You're welcome to do all that stuff. The only thing you wouldn't be welcome to do at this point is receive communion, because you need to be received into the Catholic Church as a member to do that under ordinary circumstances. And, it'd be a little while before that happens, but, you'll get there. What you can do instead of receiving communion, in many places, you'll notice people may go up in a communion line and they cross their arms over their chest and bow their head. And that's a sign that they'd like to receive a blessing. Now, this is not something that is actually mentioned in the church's liturgical law, but it's become a custom in many places for people who want to go up and want to be blessed and feel, a psychological pressure to get up with everybody else and go forward, even though they're not able to receive communion right now. And, you'd be welcome to do that as well, assuming that's a custom that's being used in your area.
Does that help you, Jordan?
Yes, that helped me tremendously. Thank you.
Wonderful.
No problem.
Well, thank you very, very much. Jimmy, I was thinking I'd send him the words of eternal life, true happiness, and where to find it. All right. If you'd like a lovely little book that Jimmy wrote, I'd love to send it to you, Jordan. All you got to do is hang on the line. We'll get an address and we will send it off. And please call as more questions come up, because I can tell you this, if you've got them, there's a lot of people that have got them, and we'd be happy to answer them. And right now, I will go to Donald in central New Jersey, listening on 89.3 FM. Donald, thank you for the call. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Yeah. Hi, Si, and hi, Jimmy. Jimmy, I believe it was the Gospel of Mark where there's a shorter ending and a longer ending. Is that right?
Yes, in broad strokes.
And I'm wondering why that was. And the longer ending, was that written by someone other than Mark?
Okay. The ending of Mark's gospel is very much discussed and debated in scholarly circles, and while scholars have different opinions on it, nobody really knows the answers for sure. What we do know is that we have a bunch of Greek manuscripts of Mark and manuscripts in a few other languages too, but Greek was the original language. And in the oldest of them, or at least key old manuscripts, Mark 16, the last chapter in Mark, cuts off at verse 8. And it's on a rather startling note. Mark has just related how the women went to the tomb of Christ and they saw angels, and the angels tell them to go tell the disciples and that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. And or at least they'll see Jesus in Galilee. And then it says, and they fled and didn't tell anybody because they were afraid. And that's it. There's no closure on this story. And so a question has been, why is that? And there are a number of proposals. One proposal is that that's because that's really where Mark decided to stop writing. And he, on this theory, was doing something avant-garde. It's as if he's saying to the audience, the women didn't tell about Jesus because they were too scared. So what about you, the reader? Are you going to be too scared to tell people about Jesus, or are you going to do what you should and tell them about Jesus? And that's a very modern avant-garde kind of ending. And so a lot of people think that's not really what Mark was trying to do, in part because Mark is not the most polished writer in Greek, so you wouldn't expect him to do something really avant-garde like that. Another proposal is that Mark was writing and then he got interrupted for some reason and just didn't have a chance to finish. So on both of those, but that seems really improbable also. On both of those two theories, the reason Mark doesn't have a longer ending is because Mark stopped writing at that point. But then there's another theory which says, no, Mark did probably write an ending that was longer, but it's been lost. And then we end up with other endings for Mark's gospel. And what we find when we survey the different manuscripts of Mark's gospel, many of them have what's called the longer ending, which is basically 12 verses long. It runs from Mark 16:9 to Mark 16:20, and it's the familiar one you're going to see in most Bibles. But there are a few other ones too. They're not quite as long as the longer ending, but they're a little bit more than what the short ending has. One of them has, or at least one of them has, an interesting saying in it that is not preserved elsewhere in the Gospels. And this saying, or logion, to use a fancy word for saying, is found in a manuscript that was owned by a guy named Freer, Freer. And so it's called the Freer logion. And so some endings of Mark have the Freer logion in them. So there are a variety of different endings. The most common one, as I said, is the longer ending. And the longer ending, now some people will say, actually, that's Mark. Mark wrote the longer ending. But most scholars disagree with that because the style of the last 12 verses of Mark is notably different in Greek than the rest of Mark. In fact, it's even obvious in English. If you're thinking about it and you're reading along in Mark 16, it's like you hit verse 9 and all of a sudden the style changes, and it's even obvious in English that the style is changing. And it reads like it's a summary of things that we mostly know from elsewhere. It seems to recapitulate the ending of Matthew. It has some material that's found in Luke. It's got some material from John and Acts. And it looks like, and this is the most common theory among scholars about how we got the longer ending, is that because Christians thought the ending of Mark was too abrupt and needed closure, someone, most likely in the 2nd century, like the early 2nd century, knew how the story ended from Matthew and Luke and John and Acts. And so they just kind of summarized that with a little bit of church tradition mixed in too, because not everything in the longer ending is mentioned in the Bible. but it looks like they just kind of synthesized that material and wrote a new ending to Mark to give it that sense of closure that the other Gospels give us, but that the shorter ending doesn't. So that's kind of a general survey, but as I indicated, there's a lot of debate in this area, and nobody really knows for sure.
Donald, thank you very much for the call. That all makes sense to you?
Yep, that was very good. Thank you.
That was very good. Thank you. Thanks very, very much. Let's see. We'll go to Chad in Oklahoma watching on YouTube. Chad, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hello. My question for Jimmy is, how serious should I take Gematria?
Mm-hmm.
And, what's kind of the purpose of it?
Okay, well, Gematria, I should explain for folks who may not know, is a process that you can do with certain languages that use letters for numbers. And that may seem strange to us, so that makes it a good cliffhanger. So I'll tell you more about Gematria on the other side of the break.
Hang on, Chad. It's a good question. We'll get an answer right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Why We're Catholic is the one book you can hand to anyone to invite them into or back to the Catholic faith. With more than 400,000 copies sold, Trent Horn's book has had a #1 ranking on Amazon.com for 5 years running. Now available in softcover, bulk cases, ebook, and on Audible. Find out what the excitement is all about. Order your copies of Why We're Catholic at shop.catholic.com or visit whywearecatholic.com.
When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore.
If you're not a Bible scholar, the full message of how the Sunday Mass readings fit together can be tough to comprehend. Apologist Carlo Broussard is here to help. Join Carlo every Friday for the Sunday Catholic Word podcast. In each episode, he unpacks the scripture readings for that Sunday and brings them all together so you can better understand and defend the faith. Visit SundayCatholicWord.com to subscribe. That's SundayCatholicWord.com.
Are you scared to talk about abortion? Don't worry, almost everyone is. You can overcome this fear as Trent Horn shows in the newly revised and expanded second edition of Persuasive Pro-Life. With a little knowledge and a few proven techniques, you can become a bold and effective apologist for life. Visit shop.catholic.com to order your copy of Persuasive Pro-Life and never again be afraid to speak up. Also available at good Catholic bookstores. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's open forum, and we left a cliffhanger for Chad in Oklahoma asking Jimmy about Gematria. Jimmy, you were in the midst of you were in the beginning of your answer.
Yeah, so in some languages, English is not one of these, but in some languages, the letters of the alphabet serve double duty, and they also represent numbers. And this is true of Hebrew, it's true of Aramaic, it's true of Greek, it's even true of Latin. Although in Latin, only a few letters have numbers. You know, I represents 1 in Latin, V represents 5, X represents 10, L represents 50, C represents 100, D represents 500, and so on. But that's only a few of the letters. Not most letters in Latin don't have a numerical value. But in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, all of them do. And the way they do that is they start, you've got this ordered sequence of letters, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, and so on. Mm-hmm. Or in Hebrew, it's going to be aleph, bet, gimel, dalet, hey. And so what they do is for the first 10 letters, they assign them the numbers 1 to 10. So Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3, and so on. And then once you hit the 10th letter, which happens to be Yud in Hebrew, you then, for the next 10 letters, you give them multiples of 10. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and so on. And then when you get to the 20th letter, which represents 100, all the letters after that, you start jumping by hundreds. So 100, 200, 300, 400. And so that's how you assign numbers to the letters, because they didn't have what we have now, which are the modern, we call them frequently Arabic numerals. Really, they're Indian numerals, but they passed into European culture by way of the Middle East. So they're called Arabian, even though they're really from India. And they didn't have that. So they used the letters of the alphabet instead. And what that means is if you have your name, Cy Kellett, written in one of these languages, you can say, okay, Psi, that's got a, well, they didn't have the letter C back then, but its equivalent would have been K. So you could take the numerical value for K, and they didn't have a Y back then. So
I didn't exist back then.
But what they would have used in Greek instead was upsilon. So you could take the value for kappa and the value for upsilon and add them together and get a numerical value for psi. And you could do that for your whole name. So why would you do this? Well, in the ancient world, a lot of people did it just for fun. It was a kind of a game that they would do, and they could play games with the numbers that they could add up based on different words and how they were spelled. Sometimes they would use it for privacy reasons. Like one of my favorite pieces, probably my most favorite piece of, well, certainly one of my most favorite pieces of ancient graffiti is one that says, "I love her whose number is 545."
Oh.
And so this was someone declaring their love for someone in a private way, because most people are not going to take the time to figure out, let's add up the number of all the young ladies in the village and figure out who has 545. But the lady would know it, and she would know that she would know her own number, and so she would know she has a secret admirer. And so you could use it to send private messages like that. It also, because of people's beliefs that the world is ruled by God or the gods, they could attribute spiritual significance to these numbers, and they could think, oh, this is a sign of how bad this guy is. Look at well, I'll give you an example. If you take Nero Caesar and add it up according to one of its common spellings in Hebrew or Aramaic, which use the same system, it adds up to 666. And there also was, it got noticed that the word in Revelation for beast, therion, also adds up to 666. So it's like, what a beast that Nero is. The word for beast adds up to 666. The name Nero Caesar adds up to 666, and it would be another sign that Nero is the beast. So they would do things like that, and they also they had other ways of, well, I won't go into it all, but it's fascinating stuff. How seriously should we take it? Well, in some passages, in some cases, it can really shed light on what biblical authors were thinking about, because John is using 666 as a privately coded symbol. He's sending a message. It's not, I love her whose number is 545. It's, this 666 guy is a really bad dude and don't have anything to do with him. So John is using it for privacy. And John may also be using it in a more symbolic, spiritual sense, because it also adds up to 666. The word for beast does. And so it can shed light on what's in the biblical author's mind and things like that. and other authors' minds. If you're reading ancient literature and the ancient author is using Gematria, then you can get an insight into what he's thinking. So it should be taken seriously in those situations as a tool for interpretation and figuring out what an ancient author is thinking. But should we attribute some kind of magical significance to this? Should we regularly be adding up words and trying to get messages out of them? Well, no, not really, because number one, you can't even do this in English. Any system of numerical values that you stuck on the English alphabet would be purely arbitrary. And so it's not like God is using English letters to communicate the stuff to us, because English letters don't have numerical values. So that's one caution. Another is there's just a lot of random noise in the system. And unless you're divinely guided by the Holy Spirit to find the rare instances where God might have intervened, you're going to come up with junk, and you're going to mislead yourself by false connections, because humans are incredible pattern matchers. We will see patterns in random data. And it's like watching an old style TV that has static on it. You watch it for a few minutes, your mind is going to start seeing patterns in the static in front of you, like little spinning wheels or faces or things like that, because they're here. And So no, we really shouldn't take Gematria seriously today, except as a tool to help us understand what ancient authors were thinking.
Chad, I am going to leave it there. I'm very glad that you asked that question. That was very interesting. Thank you for calling and asking. But I got all the lines full. So on we go to Scott in Rockfort, Missouri, listening on 106.1 FM. Scott, thank you for waiting. Go ahead with your question, please.
Hey, guys. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
I got good. Hey, I got kind of a two-part question here to go together. I'm really intrigued by the Christian crusaders, and I'm wondering if the Catholics have some sort of a fierce warrior like that. And the second part of that is, do you think we're getting close to a time where we're going to need warriors to go out and viciously conquer in God's name? It's kind of my two-part question there.
Okay, well, Catholics...
I'll hang up and listen. I'm on the road.
Okay, well, the answers are fairly straightforward. Actually, the Crusaders were Catholic. The Crusades were military endeavors that were conducted by people who were Catholic. In fact, the initial ones were called for by popes, because there had been problems in the Middle East where Muslims had been abusing local Christians in the Middle East and blocking Christian access to the holy sites, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and things like that. And so the popes actually called for the earliest crusades, and then Christian princes, who were all Catholic, because there weren't any Protestants at the time, Christian princes responded, and they got their knights together and they went over, and in the First Crusade they won, and they established a new kingdom of Jerusalem that had Catholic Christian kings of this new kingdom. Over time, the other crusades were progressively less successful, and they lost territory, and eventually what were known as the Crusader states, which included the Kingdom of Jerusalem and a few others, they ended up reverting to Muslim control. But actually, the crusades were done by Catholics. They weren't done by other Christians like Protestants. Protestants didn't exist, and Eastern Orthodox may have had a little bit of participation, but they weren't really leading the crusades. So they were fundamentally a Catholic endeavor. Do I foresee us nearing a time where I think there will be Christians going out conquering in God's name? No. I don't foresee that anytime in the foreseeable future, because it would not be perceived well. It would tend to inflame things. And so I think that even though military action may be needed in various places, it's not going to be framed in terms of a religious crusade. We even saw this after 9/11, when the Bush administration decided that they needed to go to war, both in Afghanistan and a little bit later in Iraq, and they initially used language about, like, this is a new crusade. And then when they saw the way the Muslim world reacted to it being described as a crusade, because in the Muslim world, the crusades have this horrible reputation, they very quickly backpedaled on that description, and they yanked it and stopped referring to these new pair of wars as a crusade. So I don't think we're likely to. We may see military action in the future, but I don't think it's going to be framed in terms of this is a religious war that we Christians are going to do now. I think they would keep the religious element certainly out of the public branding.
Scott, thank you. Scott did let go of the line, so we thank you for the call, and I hope that was helpful to you. We're going to take a very, very brief break and be back with more of your questions. It's an open forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
This is Archbishop Paul Coakley of the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, and you're listening to Catholic Answers Live.
Who was the first Catholic in your family? Were they evangelized by a friend? A coworker, a stranger? Did you ever think that you could be that person that God uses to save a soul, and that soul could save their family, their grandchildren, and generations to come? At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we train, equip, and mobilize Catholic disciples to do the urgent work of evangelization. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
I'm continually amazed and humbled at the way God can work through me to help so many people. Although I have no idea what the caller's questions will be that day, I trust that the Holy Spirit can use my education and experience to guide, challenge, or comfort those who call.
Mast Appeal with Colleen Kelly Mast. Saturday morning, 9 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. It's open forum. It's a little bit of bonus open forum because it's Friday and Jimmy's here, and you are welcome to call with any question you've got. 888-318-7884. Sean is in Atlanta, Georgia, listening on the Quest, the big giant Catholic radio station there in Atlanta. We're very happy you're here. Sean, go ahead with your question for Jimmy. Do I not have a... Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Hit line one. He's on line one.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Sean. I apologize. Okay. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Okay. A group of us are doing the Catechism in a year. And so we got in a debate our last meeting. And some said the Catechism was infallible. And I said, well, the doctrine and dogma are infallible, but the Catechism as a whole is not infallible. And I gave the example with the death penalty not being admissible. And then his response back was that it was an increase of knowledge, there's no change, and that it's infallible. So what else? I'm not sure what else I could have added that to respond other than it's not infallible.
Well, you're right that it's not infallible. I would modify what you said is infallible a little bit. Not all doctrine is infallible. Some doctrines have been taught infallibly, and within the set of infallible doctrines, there is a subset that's called dogma. Dogma represents teachings that are not only infallible, but that also have been infallibly declared by the Catholic Church to be divinely revealed. So I wouldn't say that all the dogma and doctrine in the Catechism is infallible. The dogma is infallible, that's repeated in the Catechism, and any other infallible teachings that are in the Catechism are also infallible. But beyond that, there's a lot of doctrine that's not infallible. And so how would I document that? Well, this is a question that was actually addressed by Pope Benedict XVI back when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, because as Cardinal Ratzinger, he was the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and he oversaw the writing of the Catechism. And when the Catechism came out, he published an essay, which is part of a little short book that it's called Introduction to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And in his essay, he discusses this question because some theologians at the time were concerned about, so like, is everything in the Catechism infallible now? And he said, no, the Catechism is not an act of infallibility. Instead, it's a summary of what the Church teaches. And so all of the individual teachings in the Catechism have exactly the same weight that they already had. So it doesn't modify the teaching, the level of authority a teaching has. It just summarizes, here's what the Church teaches. And so if the Church teaches a particular doctrine infallibly, well, it's going to be still infallible when it's in the Catechism. But if the Church teaches a doctrine that has a lower level of authority, then it's going to have that same lower level of authority in the Catechism, because the Catechism is not elevating everything to the status of infallibility. It's just summarizing what the Church already teaches. And so that was the answer of the guy who was responsible for writing the Catechism and a future pope. So I would point that out to your friend. If you Google Catechism Infallible Jimmy Akin, you should get a blog post I've written that also contains the exact quotation from Cardinal Ratzinger, so you could show that to him.
Okay, Ashan?
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Where are you in the catechism? Oh, I guess you're right where Father Mike is probably, huh? Because he's still in the midst of it.
Yeah, we're at 257.
Yeah. Oh, all right.
Yeah, 1250. Well, whatever it is, where he is. We're,
Yeah.
I guess, 2/3 through.
Did you do the Bible in a year with him?
No, I want to do that next, though.
Oh, okay.
I do.
All right. Very good.
But
Well,
I haven't done it. Okay.
thank you, Ashan.
I'm trying to do the
Thank
Science
you.
Encyclopedia in a year.
The Science Encyclopedia?
Yeah.
Are you really?
Yeah.
And how do you do that?
You just read the Science Encyclopedia until you're done with it.
Or until the year is up and you didn't.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to Frank in McHenry, Illinois, listening on 88.5 FM. Frank, thank you for waiting. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, Jimmy. My question is actually in regards to Joseph and Mary. Do we have any information on, like, the death, like when Joseph died or when Mary died or how they died? Because I'm just kind of curious, like, how long Joseph was in Jesus' life, here on earth as well.
So we have some evidence in the case of Joseph, and we know he was still alive when Jesus was 12 years old, because he's mentioned in the finding of the temple in Luke chapter 2. But when Jesus begins his adult ministry at about the age of 30, Joseph is nowhere to be found. He's not ever mentioned as appearing on camera, so to speak, during Jesus' adult ministry. And then in AD 33, at the end of Jesus' adult ministry, it's real clear he's not alive, because on the cross, Jesus entrusts the care of Mary to the beloved disciple. And it makes it clear that the beloved disciple then took Mary into his own home and treated her like a member of his family. And that would make absolutely no sense if Joseph were still alive. So given the absence of Joseph in Jesus' adult ministry and his real clear death by the crucifixion, it would appear that Joseph died before Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his ministry, and that would correspond to AD 28. When Jesus was 12 would correspond to about AD 10. So it looks like there's about an 18-year window between AD 10 and AD 28 when Joseph died. We can't be more precise than that, and we don't know how he died, but we can reasonably deduce from the evidence of Scripture that he died sometime between AD 10 and AD 28. What about Mary? Well, there's actually even a debate about, did Mary actually die, or was she assumed into heaven while she was still alive? The majority opinion has been that she did die and then was assumed body and soul into heaven after she died. But that's an opinion that's not mandatory church teaching. When it comes to when that would have happened, well, it would have been after AD 33, because Mary is still appearing on camera, so to speak, in the beginning chapters of Acts, which correspond to AD 33. So we know it was sometime after that, but we don't know exactly when it would have been. Presumably, it would have been sometime in the first century, because in order for Mary to give birth to Jesus at about age, in 3 or 2 BC, which is what the evidence indicates, she would have needed to be, at least 14 then. And so, and in fact, if memory serves, that's the age that an early 2nd century document says she was when she gave birth to Jesus. Although I'd have to verify that just to be sure. But she then would have been born about 16 BC, let's say. And if she lived for 100 years, that would take us up to AD 86. But she may not have lived to be 100 years old. If she lived to be 80 years old, that would be AD 66. If she lived to be 70 years old, that would be AD 56. We know she lived at least to AD 33, so she was something like maybe 47 years old at that time, but we don't know how much longer after that it was before she died, and we don't know how she died either.
Frank, I'm going to leave that there. I hope that was helpful to you. Thank you very much for the call. Let's go to Emma in Hayden, Idaho, watching on YouTube. Hi, Emma.
Hi. So I asked a question last week, and it was my fault. I didn't ask it right.
Oh.
So I'm wondering, when are you culpable for believing in the Catholic Church? Like, when I was a Protestant, I really felt like I had the true religion. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, is it, and I learned, it took me 5 years to get through my head, is it when you know the Catholic Church is the truth and you walk away from it? Or is it at some other point?
Well, it is when you become responsible for believing something, and it doesn't matter what that is. It could be that the Catholic Church is true. It could be that it's raining outside. But when you become responsible for believing something, whatever that thing is when you have seen enough evidence that you should believe it. So it's not just hearing the claim. It's not just when you become convinced of it, because you can see enough evidence that should convince you and yet refuse to believe something. I mean, for example, let's suppose, Emma, that you have a son, and I don't know the status of your family at all, so this is a purely made-up example off the top of my head. But let's suppose you have a teenage son who is using drugs, and you need to correct him. You need to tell him, stop using drugs. Well, certainly you would be obliged to do so once you firmly believe he's using drugs. But suppose you're not at that point. Suppose you're like a lot of parents who don't want to admit something is true, and you may start seeing evidence that your son is using drugs, and you may see evidence that would convince a normal person that your son is using drugs. But once you've seen that evidence, we're into the territory where it's going to become your responsibility. But if you absolutely refuse and you just make excuses and refuse to accept that your son is using drugs, even though you've seen overwhelming evidence that he is, then you're responsible for not believing that, because you're refusing to accept the evidence you've been given. And that's true of any belief. It's true of, is your son using drugs? It's true of, is it raining outside? It's true of the Catholic faith. The point you become responsible is the point that you have seen enough evidence that you ought to believe it.
Emma, does that help you?
That's fabulous. Thank you so much.
Oh, fabulous is a very good review. Thank you very much, Emma.
It's spiffy, too.
Oh, it was spiffy. All right, what a spiffy answer, Jimmy.
Regular listener there. Yeah.
She heard that earlier in the week. Emma, thanks. That brings us to the end of this hour. So, but if you're on the line, stay on the line. We're going to just be a couple minutes, and then we'll be back with more Jimmy Akin Open Forum. If you haven't called yet, there'll be 2 or 3 lines open at least during the break. A great time to call, get in the queue, and get your question answered. Anybody is welcome. Any question at all. It's open forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and the number 888-318-7884. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. It's open forum. That's a good thing. That's a little bonus on a Friday. An open forum. You can call and ask any question you want. 888-318-7884. You want me to tell you it's even better than that? Jimmy Akin's here. You can, and you know when Jimmy's here, you can ask whatever you want. Like we really literally mean whatever you want. 888-318-7884. Don't ask about sports ball.
No sports ball. Yeah. But other than that, most subjects.
Okay, fair enough. Lots of folks on the line, so I think as a matter of fact, every line full at the moment. So I think I'll go right back to the phones if that's all right with you, Jimmy.
Sure.
All right, let's go to Fredericksburg, Virginia. John is in Fredericksburg, Virginia, watching on YouTube. John, thank you very much for the call. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi, guys. Thanks for taking my call. Jimmy, I've recently taken an interest in medieval saints, particularly royal kings. Saint Stephen of Hungary, Saint Henry, the Holy Roman Empire. My question is about Charlemagne, because I've heard mixed reviews. If Charlemagne is a saint or considered a saint in the church, and if he's someone we should revere or not.
Well, what I can tell you is I haven't done a detailed research into Charlemagne's case, but what I can tell you is that my understanding is that Charlemagne was canonized by Pope Pascal III. But there's a problem, because Pascal III was not really a pope. He was what's known as an anti-pope. That is a false claimant to the papal office. And after his tenure, one of the Lateran councils canceled all of his decrees because he had exercised authority illegitimately. And so that means that Charlemagne is not today regarded as a saint in the Catholic Church. I have heard it claimed that he is recognized as a beatus, that is someone who is blessed, someone who has been beatified, but I have not been able to locate when or where that was done or how, so I don't know that that's the case. What I can say is he's not a saint, because the pope who tried to canonize him wasn't actually a pope, but whether or not he's a beatus, I would need to run it to ground to say, okay, so where and when, what were the circumstances of his beatification in order to establish if he was a beatus.
Okay, John?
Okay, so approach that with caution then.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. I know you waited through the break and everything, so thank you for waiting so we could get that question on. And call anytime if you got a question. I'm going to go to Austin, Texas now. Troy is in Austin, Texas, listening on the Catholic Answers Live app. Troy, glad you're here. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi. I got a question for you. It's really not so much about anything in particular, but it is about what you said in the past and a couple things that I've heard Trent Horn say in the past as well. I guess the best way that I could put it is I've heard you guys approximately say that God couldn't make a square circle or something like that. I'm really just giving this as an invitation for you to speak more about that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Well, I like the way, Troy, that you may have put it to the call screener, because he wrote, you've said that God can't make 1 + 1 = 3. Could you elaborate more on that? And sure, in fact, there are discussions of what 1 + 1 equals that are of considerable length. Back in the early 20th century, a couple of mathematical philosophers named Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead were doing a work called Principia Mathematica on the foundations of mathematics, and they took it's something like 300 pages to rigorously prove that 1 + 1 = 2. I mean, that's really, you get like 300 pages into the book and you get up to the 1 + 1 = 2 point. So they were being really rigorous. And what they were doing was trying to use logic extremely rigorously to establish the foundations of mathematics, and they did that. Unfortunately, their overall project was to ground all of mathematics in logic in a rigorous way, And they thought they might have succeeded. And then in around, I think it was 1930, the German mathematician Kurt Gödel came and smashed their project to the ground by proving that any sufficiently powerful mathematical system will incorporate statements that cannot be proved from fundamental axioms. It's a proof known as Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And it demonstrated that not just Russell and Whitehead couldn't ground mathematics rigorously in logic, but nobody could. There will always be additional mathematical truths that you cannot prove from a limited finite set of axioms. But what Russell and Whitehead did succeed in doing was rigorously showing that 1 + 1 = 2. That was one of the things they showed. And so that means 1 + 1 can't equal 3 by definition. And that's the key to what you've heard me say before and what you've heard Trent say before, which is that in his omnipotence, God can bring about any logically possible state of affairs. And so he has loads of power. Anything that's logically possible, God can make happen. And so what's logically possible mean? Well, it's a term of art that gets used in philosophy. And basically something's logically possible as long as the terms involved do not contradict each other. So Cy Kellett is wearing a blue blouse. There are no contradictions involved in those terms, so it's logically possible that Cy Kellett could be wearing a blue blouse. Or Cy Kellett has a koala clipped to his microphone. Well, there's no contradiction in those terms, so God could bring it about that Cy Kellett has a koala clipped to his microphone. But Cy Kellett is an unmarried, is a married bachelor. That God could not bring about because married and bachelor contradict each other. So you can say Cy Kellett is a married bachelor, but that doesn't have any actual meaning because the terms involved, bachelor and married, contradict each other. Similarly, you could say the man Cy Kellett is a prime number. Well, that's also just nonsense because the concept of man and the concept of prime number contradict each other. You can't have a man that's a prime number or a prime number that's a man. So that would, again, be something you can say, but if you try to cash it out in what would this mean, it turns out to just be gibberish. And so the idea is God can make anything that's possible, but he can't make things that are gibberish, that don't have any sensible meaning, because the terms involved contradict each other. So if you go back to our original example, if you think about the meaning of the term one and the meaning of the term plus and the meaning of the term one and the meaning of the term equal, if you understand those terms correctly, they don't equal 3, they equal 2, as Russell and Whitehead showed rigorously. So that's a general sketch of what logical possibility is and how it applies to different examples.
Troy, that's what you were looking for?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm still having a few issues with, I don't know, God, it seems such a powerful being to me. He would only be an immensely powerful being, not a perfectly powerful being, if he couldn't make a square circle. Or, I remember I was in high school and I would be questioned, can God make a boulder that he can't move? And it wasn't a very tough question.
Yeah.
So what the solution is, you need to understand or try to understand the concepts of things that you want God to make. In the case of a square circle, the way that is, now we're not talking about a cylinder where you look at it from above and it's a circle and you look at it from the side and it's a square. That's not what we mean when we say square circle. When the question is posed, can God make a square circle? We're talking about a shape, a two-dimensional shape that has a circular perimeter only and that has a square perimeter only at the same time, in the same place, in the same relation. And if you try to think about that, you'll realize that there's just a contradiction there. That has no sensible meaning. And so God is perfectly powerful in the sense he can create anything that has meaning, but square circle does not have meaning. And in the same way, if you think about rock too heavy for God to lift, well, God has infinite lifting power, and there's different kinds of infinities, but just scale it up to the top. In order for a rock to be too heavy for God to lift, it would have to weigh more than infinity. And more than infinity has no meaning. It involves a logical contradiction because the infinite is unlimited by definition. So the rock would have to have more than unlimited weight in the strongest sense of unlimited. And that, again, that just has no meaning. So God is perfectly powerful in the sense that he can make absolutely everything that has meaning, but he can't make gibberish. If I said, can God make Mamu Dogface the Banana Patch? Well, that's Mamu Dogface the Banana Patch, as Steve Martin informs us, has no meaning. It doesn't mean anything. So I haven't said something that God could make, because Mamu Dogface the Banana Patch doesn't have any meaning at all. It incorporates elements like Dogface and Banana Patch that do have meaning, but when you put it all together, it doesn't mean anything. And in the same way, if you say square circle or rock too heavy for God to lift or four-sided triangle, when the individual terms have meaning, but when you put them all together, they don't have meaning because they contradict each other. And so God is perfectly powerful in the sense he can make anything that has meaning, but he can't make meaningless things that make no logical sense.
Troy, I do hope that was helpful. Thank you for the call and the question. We have to take a quick break. Right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Miss a show? Make sure to catch up by downloading the podcast, available online at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
We should pray because prayer is conversation with God, and conversation is the only way to build a relationship. We need that relationship with God. We should pray and talk with God about what's on our hearts, what's on our minds, what's active in our lives, the joys we have. We should share all of these with God. Prayer is conversation, and conversation is the only way to build a relationship with God. It's the most important relationship. All of our other relationships depend on this one.
Catholic Answers Live, Open Forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Your call is welcome, 888-318-7884. And hey, we're having a big, giant digital mega sale over at shop.catholic.com. Check it out. Hundreds of ebooks, MP3s, e-magazines, digital videos, and online courses are on sale. The savings are up to 50%, which is pretty awesome. And if you don't get over there today, no problem. We're keeping it through midnight Hawaii time on Sunday. That's midnight Honolulu time on Sunday. The sale will end. Digital mega sale. Don't miss out on dynamite savings at shop.catholic.com. Jimmy Akin, our guest, as I said, and lots of folks on the line. And I don't think we have spoken to a Canadian yet today. So we go to Roman in Alberta, Canada, watching on YouTube. Roman, thank you for the call. Go ahead with the question.
Hey, Jimmy. I just wanted to compliment you on your debate with Dr. Michael Heiser on the New Testament reliability about a year ago. I just seen it recently, and I thought you killed it.
Oh, thank you. That was actually Dr. Bart Ehrman. But yes, thank you.
Oh, what did I say?
Oh, you said Michael Heiser. I think you're about to ask a question about Dr. Michael Heiser. Yeah,
that's
right.
my question. Yes.
Okay,
that's my
yeah.
question. Are you aware of Dr. Michael Heiser and on his work on the Divine Council, and what are your thoughts on it? Me personally, after reading his book, such as The Unseen Realm, it has brought me back to Catholicism as I was reading it. It sounded so much like Intercession of Saints.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Yes, I know of Michael Heiser. I even knew Michael Heiser. I had contact with him. I even interviewed him once, although the interview didn't end up getting published, but it may at some point if I ever find the files. But he was, for people who may not know, he was an evangelical scholar, and he was a specialist in ancient Near Eastern languages and texts. And so one of the things that he did was he would look at biblical texts in light of other ancient Near Eastern literature that could shed light on them. And one of the things that he wrote about was what's known as the Divine Council. The Divine Council is an image that is used in a variety of ancient Near Eastern texts that talk about God, the high God, El, and an association of other heavenly beings who serve as his council. And the way this is pictured, for example, in Canaanite literature, is you've got the high god El, and then you have this pantheon of lesser gods that serve as El's council, and they discuss matters. They, under El's, who's the supreme king, under El's rule, they make decisions, and they cause things in the world and to happen, and so it functions like a king's court. Because a king in the ancient Near East, I mean, he's not the only guy in the government. He's the top guy. He's the decision maker or the decider, as George Bush would say. But he's not the only guy. He's got a council of advisors who give him advice and make proposals and execute his orders. And so the ancient Near Eastern people frequently would consider God like that. God is a great king, so he must have a council up there that's assisting him. Now, the Canaanites would regard these other deities, these other council members, I should say, as deities that you could worship. So, for example, you could worship Baal, the storm god, and you could worship Yam, the sea god, and you could worship Mot, the god of death, or Asherah, who was a goddess, or things like that. And the Hebrews said, no, you can't. At least we can't. We have a covenant with El, with Yahweh, the creator. We're not supposed to worship anybody else. But they didn't have a problem with the idea of God having a council. In fact, we even see it referred to in a number of passages in the Old Testament. One of the easiest ones to see is in the book of Job. In the book of Job, we begin with the scene in heaven, and it says, one day up in heaven, the sons of God came in before God. So this is El. That the El is just the Hebrew word for God. So you've got the sons of El, or the sons of God, coming before El, or God. And also Satan, or Satan, to pronounce it the English way, he comes in too. Satan in Hebrew means accuser or adversary or opponent. And what we're seeing here is a court scene, like a king's court. In a king's court, Psychelet. Who are the most important people in a king's court? Is it the lowly messengers who run errands, or is it the princes, the sons of the king?
That would be those princes.
Yeah, so we've got these high-ranking celestial beings that are referred to as sons of El, and then also this opponent comes in, and he's basically the court prosecutor, or you could think of him as like a kind of a spy. He's and God says to Satan, "What have you been doing?" And he says, "Well, I've been walking up and down on the earth." You know, which is what you do if you're kind of a watchman or spy for the king. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? Because he's a super cool dude. And Satan falsely accuses Job and says, oh, he's only a fair weather friend. I haven't been able to hurt him because you put a hedge around him, but, you know, let him get hit with affliction and he'll curse you to your face. And God says, well, we'll see about this, won't we? And he lets Satan have the ability to inflict harm on Job, but not to kill him. And indeed, Job does not curse God. He gets a little confused later in the book, but he does not curse God. He remains faithful. And so God proves Satan wrong. Well, this is basically a courtroom scene where you've got the king, you've got the king's court consisting of the princes, and you've got a court official whose job is basically to function like a prosecutor. And so we see the divine counsel not only in non-Israelite ancient Near Eastern literature, we also see it in the Bible. And this is not unique to Michael Heiser. This is actually this is commonly received, this is the commonly received view among people who've studied this question. And I've studied it myself. In fact, I was writing about the divine counsel before I knew Michael Heiser, before I'd read his stuff. If you go to my personal website, jimmyakin.com, and type in divine counsel, you'll find some stuff I wrote about it before I even knew Mike. So I think that his work on the divine counsel is valuable. I don't agree with everything Mike thought. And by the way, he passed away earlier this year, just a few months ago. So I would encourage people to pray for the repose of his soul and for the wife and children he left behind, because he died at a not that old age. And he left a family behind him. So I would very much encourage people to pray for them and for Mike. I don't agree with everything he said, but he did a lot of valuable work.
All right, Roman.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the call. On we go to Cleveland now. Al is in Cleveland, Ohio, listening on AM 1260 The Rock. Al, glad you're here. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hello, Jimmy and everybody. I just want to let everybody know my mom is watching the TV in another room, so she's waiting to hear my question here.
Hi, Mom.
What's your question?
So my question is, in the Bible, there's the two witnesses of Revelation, and that's chapter 11, verse 3. And those are commonly understood to be Enoch and Elijah. And then in the fourth book of Kings, Elijah is taken up in a fiery chariot. And so it's commonly understood, my understanding and tradition is that Elijah and Enoch are the only two mortals that have never experienced death. They're still alive. I mean, that's just what I've read or heard. So is that true? And if it is true, I mean, Elijah's taken up in a chariot, so then what? Is Elijah and Enoch, are they living on the moon or something? Are they in outer space?
Where are they?
How does this work? Where are they?
All right, Jimmy. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I got enough to answer the question.
Yeah.
So what the Bible says in regard to Enoch is that he walked with the Lord for 365 years, and then he was no more, for the Lord took him. But it doesn't say where, but presumably he's not on earth anymore. When it comes to Elijah, it says that God took him up into heaven, and it uses the word for heaven in Hebrew, which is Shemaim. And so he took him to Shemaim in a whirlwind. You'll sometimes hear it said that he took him up in a fiery chariot. Not right. God came down in a fiery chariot when this happened, but Elijah himself goes up in a whirlwind. So we're told his location is Shemaim. Now, that wouldn't prevent him from going, and by Shemaim, it would be understood he went to the place where God is, not the heaven of the atmosphere, not the heaven of outer space, but the heaven of God and the angels. And so that's the view that's common among scholars, is that, well, okay, it's saying that these two individuals basically were taken to God's heaven, not the moon or some other location. That wouldn't stop them from going elsewhere. In fact, as I covered in a pair of episodes on Mysterious World about the Seventh-day Prophetess, Ellen Gould White, she actually says she got to meet Enoch on another planet. So at least in her vision, she saw him on another planet, which actually, based on the evidence, would have been one of the ones in our outer solar system. Unfortunately, because the evidence points to it being one of the planets in the outer solar system, her description of it tends to count as evidence against the validity of her revelations, because she described a whole civilization of human beings on it that ain't there. So it's a fun story, but I don't think it was an accurate vision. Presumably, these individuals, Enoch and Elijah, would still be with God in the spiritual heaven, and they would have their bodies there just like Jesus and Mary have their bodies there. Exactly how that works, we don't know, but that would seem to be the case. What about the two witnesses? Well, here, there's a little bit more to say, and I'll say it on the other side of the break.
If you could hang on, we would appreciate it, and we will get you the rest of that answer on the other side of the break. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's open forum. More Catholic Answers Live right after this.
Why We're Catholic is the one book you can hand to anyone to invite them into or back to the Catholic faith. With more than 400,000 copies sold, Trent Horn's book has had a #1 ranking on Amazon.com for 5 years running. Now available in softcover, bulk cases, ebook, and on Audible. Find out what the excitement is all about. Order your copies of Why We're Catholic at shop.catholic.com or visit whywearecatholic.com.
Is relativism dead? It sure seems dead. Each day, new moral demands are made, and they are presented to us as absolutes. Everything, from transgender ideology to physician-assisted suicide, is presented as a moral good that all right-thinking people must accept. But Catholic Answer's own Carlo Broussard says look deeper, and you will see today's moralism is just relativism dressed up in new clothes. Carlo's eye-opening book, The New Relativism, shines a light on how the sacred moral teachings of this age cover up a deep denial of moral truth. Order your copy of The New Relativism today at shop.catholic.com and be prepared to defend the truth against aggressive relativism. The New Relativism at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live, open forum. Jimmy Akin, our guest. I was talking with Tim Staples just before the show, and they, Perusia Media there in Australia, and along with Catholic Answers, are sponsoring this trip that Tim is leading to the Holy Land on November 10th. And he told me they have 7 spots left. They're only taking 55 people. They have 7 spots left. If you'd like to go to the Holy Land with Tim Staples, you can do so in just about a month and a half. Just go to harvestjourneys.com and find the Footsteps of Jesus tour with Tim Staples from Perusia Ministries. Harvestjourneys.com. 888-318-7884 is our number here. Jimmy, you were in the midst of answering whatever happened to Enoch and Elijah.
Yeah, so Al asked if they might be the 2 witnesses that are described in Revelation chapter 11, and that is a common view. You will hear, you will hear the 2 witnesses described as Enoch and Elijah from various people, and you do have those 2 individuals in the Old Testament not recorded as having died, and then the 2 witnesses end up getting killed in Revelation 11. And so I guess that's what suggested to some people that they're Enoch and Elijah, and their death has just been kind of delayed, and then they finally experience death like everybody else. But I don't think that's who they are. I think that this text is working on more than one level, and on the first level we need to figure out who they are. So the clues that we need to figure out who they are really found in verse 6 of chapter 11 of Revelation. So we've got these two witnesses, and I think it's right to connect them to Old Testament figures, but not Enoch and Elijah. The first thing we read in verse 6 is they have power to shut the sky, that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. Okay, can you, Psychelet, think of anybody in the Old Testament who had the power to shut the sky to keep rain from falling as a result of his prayers? Any one of the prophets, maybe?
Elijah?
Elijah, yeah. So I think one of the witnesses is Elijah.
Oh, gotcha.
But I don't think the other one is Enoch. So here's what we're also told. In the second half of verse 6, we read, and they have the power over the waters to turn them into blood and to afflict the earth with every plague as often as they desire. So, Psychelet, can you think of anyone in the Old Testament who turned water to blood and inflicted a land with multiple plagues?
That sounds so much like Moses.
Yeah, ding, 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 Moses. So I think that's who they are on this level of the text. They're not Enoch and Elijah. They're Elijah and Moses. And I think that's very clearly telegraphed to us by John, who gives us these clues that anybody who's read the Old Testament and is familiar with it would be able to pick up on. So, I mean, you don't have to be a deep Old Testament scholar. You just have to know the basic stories, and Enoch and Elijah and Moses are going to leap out at you. So, do Moses and Elijah symbolize anything else that you're familiar with in Scripture together as a pair?
Oh, I am doing so well today. The law and the prophets.
Right. Moses is the law. Moses represents the law, and Elijah represents the prophets. So I think that's what the deeper level of the text is referring to. The law and the prophets are God's witnesses to Christ. And so I think this is a highly symbolic text. I think on one level, the symbolism points to Moses and Elijah, and on a deeper level, it points to the law and the prophets being God's witness to Jesus as the Christ.
Al, I'm going to leave it there because I've got a full bank of phone line here, so I want to get to everybody, but thanks for the question, and goodbye, Al's mom. Thanks for watching. Bill's in Ohio watching on YouTube. Bill, thank you very much for waiting. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy. Bill? All right. It's all right. I'll come back to Bill. We'll get him on the line in a moment. Let's go to Kentucky, where Jim is listening on the Catholic Answers Live app. Jim, thank you for waiting. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, guys. How are you?
Very well.
So I've been... I've reverted back to the faith back in January this year, and so I've been listening to a lot of media. And I'm from a non-Catholic tradition, and I've been listening to the Catholic media, trying to get up to speed because I've been out for 30 years. And so I went back to my non-Catholic tradition website and heard a talk where a Catholic professor was invited into a symposium, and he spoke on a Reformation topic. And he got to the question of authority, and he mentioned a term called shadow magisterium, and he defined that, and he didn't really go into it, but he defined that as things like EWTN, Scott Hahn, and Bishop Barron, and he mentioned Bishop Barron, who is a bishop who largely communicates as a teaching outside of the Episcopal channel. He didn't seem to speak in favor of this quote-unquote what he called shadow magisterium. And so I was wondering, and I tried to reach out to this person to see what he meant by that, but I haven't had success reaching him. So I wonder what you guys would think. What would that Catholic theologian mean by shadow magisterium? Do you have any idea? Is that a term that's normally used? Is that something what would you think that he meant by that?
This is a term that is not an official term, and it doesn't have any rigorous definition. You're not going to typically find this term in the scholarly literature, for example, and certainly not in church documents. But I know what he's talking about. And the basic idea would be, okay, so the magisterium functions to give official church teachings. And when you tack on the word shadow in front of it, that means a couple of things. One of them is we're not talking about the real magisterium of the church. The real magisterium of the church is the bishop's teaching in union with the Pope. And Bishop Barron, being a bishop, would be a member of the real magisterium. But what this theologian is doing is indicating that there's something else besides the real magisterium that is in some way functioning as if it were the magisterium, even though it's not. And that makes it shady, which is why he's using the term shadow magisterium as opposed to something else more neutral like alternative magisterium or second magisterium, or to use a term that was favored actually by many on the progressive end of the theological spectrum a few decades ago, the magisterium of theologians, as opposed to the magisterium of bishops. But by calling it a shadow magisterium, he's referring to it as if it's in some way shadowy or shady. And it could be functioning as a magisterium in one of two ways. Either the members of it are acting as if they were the magisterium and claiming to issue authoritative teachings themselves, or they could be perceived as representing the true teachings of the church by people who are listening to them. And it could be both of those. It could be both they're acting as if they're the magisterium and they're being perceived by some people as if they were the magisterium. So what would I make of all this? Well, I think that this is not the most helpful term, and I think you can apply it to multiple different people, multiple different groups. It's not just EWTN and Scott Hahn and Bishop Barron. I've heard it to apply to others as well, like a shadow magisterium of apologists, and you can apply it to other people as well. I think there's something you could call a shadow magisterium of exorcists. There are a variety of popular exorcists, some of whom have YouTube channels, and some people treat them as if they're the bishops and the Pope. And their first question is, I wonder what an exorcist would think about this, and that's giving an exorcist an undue amount of deference. In fact, I may be covering this in the future on Mysterious World. Exorcists, they are trained in what they do, and they get rid of demons. But if you think about it, they're basically bouncers. If you got a bar and someone's making a problem in a bar, you get the bouncer to kick the person out. Well, that's what exorcists do. And of course, like a bouncer, they're trained in how do you kick a person out of a bar. And exorcists are trained in how do you kick a demon out of a person. But that doesn't make them experts on everything. And so the question like, I wonder what an exorcist would think about that, is the wrong question. The better question would be, I wonder what someone who's studied this subject would think about it. But don't automatically defer to an exorcist in this regard, just like you wouldn't automatically defer to anybody else who hasn't studied it. And then there's the magisterium of theologians that I mentioned before, that people on the progressive end of the spectrum would cite as an alternative to the quote-unquote magisterium of bishops. You would hear this phrase magisterium of theologians all the time a number of years ago. And you would have theologians who were progressive, who were proposing their own ideas as if they were what Catholics should believe, in contradistinction to what the bishops were actually teaching. So I think there are multiple different groups that could be referred to as shadow magisteria, but I don't think that the term is particularly, I think it's an insult term. I think there is an element of truth in it. Sometimes people can represent their own views as if they're the views of the church. Very few people actually do what the magisterium does, in the sense of, I'm giving you this teaching by my own authority, actually functioning as if they were bishops. Very few people who aren't bishops do that. Scott Hahn doesn't do that. EWTN doesn't do that. So they're not functioning as the magisterium in that sense. Instead, what they're doing is giving their opinion of what they think the magisterium says. And you can think they're right, you can think they're wrong, you can think they're right on some points, wrong on some points. That's a matter for debate. But they're not functioning as a magisterium just by saying, I think the church teaches this. They're doing their best instead to represent the magisterium to other people. And so I don't think it's fair to accuse them on that ground of being a shadow magisterium, because they're just trying to communicate what they think the magisterium does teach. And I'd say the same thing about someone who on the progressive end of the spectrum. If they're trying to communicate what they think the church does teach, whether they're right or wrong about that, they're not pronouncing teachings in their own name by their own authority. And so I would say, they may be mistaken, but they're not acting as if they're a magisterium. What about the other way in which people could be thought of as a kind of magisterium, meaning there are people who listen to them in preference to listening to the magisterium of the bishops and the Pope? Well, I would say that's a problem. I wouldn't doubt that there are such people who treat, apologists as if it would prefer to hear what an apologist says in preference to what the bishops and the Pope have actually said, or who would want to hear what Scott Hahn or EWTN or Bishop Barron has to say in preference to the actual magisterium as a whole, or people who would want to hear what exorcists have to say or what Jimmy Akin has to say. But if there are such people, they might want to hear it just for their own information. But if they were listening to anybody that is not actually the magisterium and treating it as authoritative rather than just as a source of information to think about and consider, then that's a mistake. But it's also not the fault of the person. If there's some rabid Jimmy Akin fan out there who will take my word on anything, no matter what the Pope has said, well, I haven't done anything to encourage that. And so it wouldn't be my fault. I would want to do the best I can to let people know, hey, I'm just a layman. All I can do is give you idea. I can tell you my understanding of things. I can give you arguments to consider. I can give you evidence to consider, but I don't have authority. So don't treat me as an authoritative source in the sense you treat the magisterium as one. And so I would say there can be problems with, folks who are fans in the classic sense of fanatics who might be attached to apologists or me or Scott Hahn or an exorcist or Bishop Barron or anybody else, and treats them as having more authority than they actually do. And that's a problem, but it may not be the fault of the people in question. They may not have done anything to encourage this. And so I would say in those cases, it's unfair to refer to these people as a shadow magisterium because they haven't done anything to encourage that impression. They haven't said, listen to me in preference to the Pope and the bishops teaching in union with him. So I would say it's a slur and an insult word to use this term as a general course. Now, if there is someone out there who has been encouraging people to listen to me in preference to the bishops and the Pope and treat me as having more authority than I actually do, well, then that is a problem, and you could potentially validly accuse that person of acting as a shadow magisterium. But I think the number of people who actually do that is very few and very far between.
I want to come back to you, Jim. That you found that helpful, or did you have a follow-up question?
Well, that's great. So listen to your local diocese first, and then ask them in light of what you may hear in the quote-unquote shadow magisterium. It sounds like what you're saying.
Well, not just your local diocese, because although your local bishop is part of the magisterium, he teaches officially for the magisterium, provided he's teaching in communion with the Pope. So I would say listen to the Pope and listen to the bishops in communion with the Pope. Treat what they say as authoritative when they teach it authoritatively. If they say other things that are not meant to be authoritative teaching, then you're not obliged by that. If the Pope says, oh, chocolate ice cream is the best, a doctrinal teaching. That's just a papal opinion. So you need to be careful to differentiate those. And to help you differentiate those, I actually wrote a book called Teaching with Authority. So Jim, since you're in the United States, if you'll hang on the line, why don't we see if we can send you a copy of my book, Teaching with Authority, that's basically a theological manual on this whole subject that may give you some additional clarity.
Hang on, Jim. We'd love to send it to you. Got to take a quick break. Right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
There's only one Catholic Answers Live.
The Catechism defines evangelization as the proclamation of Christ and his gospel by word and the testimony of life. But what does that look like in real life? It looks like St. Paul street evangelists out in the public square sharing the good news. We're a Catholic nonprofit that starts conversations by handing out free sacramentals. Then we employ our method of listen, befriend, proclaim, and invite. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to learn more.
It's You Choose Week on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie starting Monday.
This is a week-long celebration of topics suggested by you, the Take Two family.
Your submissions are always welcome at take2show.com, and we will be spotlighting some of the great ideas you bring to the table on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie all next week, noon and midnight Eastern on EWTN Radio.
And it's your topics, so as a member of the Take Two family, you are the conversation.
You Choose Week on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. It's Open Forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Mary Ann in British Columbia, Canada is next. Mary Ann, go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Oh, thank you. So my question is, what would you say to someone who says, sure, there is a God, thousands of years ago, but there's no evidence of him today?
Okay, let me ask a clarifying question, because I could understand a claim like that in at least two senses. One of them is there was a God, literally a God in the past, but he doesn't exist anymore. Or I could understand it to mean God manifested himself in the past, but he doesn't manifest himself anymore. And I guess a third one is, well, there may have been some evidence of God in the past, but he didn't really exist, and there's no evidence of him today. Do you have a sense of which of those three alternatives or something else this person would mean?
Yeah, I would say the third one.
Okay. Well, I would say, no, there is evidence of God today. One of the philosophers have worked out numerous arguments for the existence of God, and they're just as valid today as they were in the past. My favorite is the argument from contingency, which begins by asking the question, why is anything the way it is? And for any given thing you could name, like why is an apple red? Assuming it's a red apple, well, you could propose, okay, well, it's red because it's got these pigments in its skin. That's okay, why does it have these pigments rather than something else? And you could say, well, because these pigments are programmed into its genetic code. Okay, so why does it have this genetic code rather than some other genetic code? Well, because of the process of evolution, it happened to evolve this way. Okay, so why does the process of evolution happen? And you can keep asking the why question, and either you've got an unlimited, infinite mountain of whys, or you've got some ultimate answer that explains all of the others. But an unlimited, limitless sequence of whys does not explain anything. It's like trying to paint a picture. It's like saying, we've got an explanation for this local thing, like the apple being red, and let's transition the image a moment to a red apple in a painting. Why is there a red apple in this painting? Well, because there was paint that was applied to the pigment. And well, how did the paint get applied to the pigment? Oh, it was on brushes or bristles. Why were the bristles applying it? Well, because they were attached to a handle. And ultimately, there's an artist moving the handle. And that's why there's a red apple in this painting. We could do the same thing with a red apple in the real world. And you could say, okay, we're going to trace this series of causes back to its root source. There's going to be some ultimate source. And whatever that source is, that's what God is. He's the ultimate cause of everything else. And not just a red apple in the world, but all the apples and everything else in the world. To say there is no ultimate cause would be like saying you can have a red apple in a painting with no artist and an infinitely long brush. Well, an infinitely long brush is analogous to an infinitely long regress of causes. And if there's no fundamental cause moving all of the rest, then it ultimately doesn't explain anything. There's no ultimate explanation. And so in order to have an ultimate explanation, whether it's for a red apple or the entire universe, you need a God. And that's just one example of an argument for God's existence. There are many others. So those are philosophical arguments for God's existence. There are others. And some of those are experiential. Now, your friend mentioned, there was evidence for God in the past. She might have been thinking of miracles, that people would interpret. They'd have some extraordinary experience and say, oh, God must have done this. But the thing is, there are miracles today. There are lots of them. They just don't get reported very often. The Catholic Church actually has a process for rigorously investigating miracles and seeing whether they can be explained naturally or not. It even has atheist doctors looking into medical miracles and saying, is there any explanation for this? They don't care if you're Catholic or not. They just want your medical expertise. And if you'd like to do some reading about modern miracles, there's a 2-volume book on miracles by the evangelical scholar Craig Keener, Keener. And he's done a lot of work documenting contemporary miracles in the world today. And so not only are there philosophical arguments for God, there are practical, experiential arguments for God as well.
Marianne, I'm going to leave it there and try to get our friend James in the Philippines on because he has been waiting. And James, welcome. Good, happy Saturday morning. Good Saturday morning to you.
Hey, Sa. Hi, Jamie.
Hi,
Howdy,
James.
We're real close to the end of the show. What's your question, James?
Yeah, my question would be: can consecration be done outside of Mass, and should consecration be done separately? Can consecration be done separately? So just to the bread and wine.
Okay.
Or both must be done together.
Okay, thanks, James.
The answer to both questions, according to the Code of Canon Law, is no. And the Code of Canon Law uses the strongest possible term in Latin for this, nefas, which means it may never be done, never under any circumstances. So you can never consecrate the two elements outside of a Mass. It doesn't have to be a Mass in a church. It could be a Mass in the open country, but it's got to be a Mass. And secondly, you can never, nefas, consecrate one element without the other. You have to consecrate both the bread and the wine in a Mass. Anything else is absolutely forbidden.
Okay, James?
Gotcha. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for calling. I've been saying hello to you every now and then on a Friday afternoon because I know you listen on Saturday mornings.
Thanks, I and salamat, Jimmy.
Yep, I'm looking forward to the day I get over to the Philippines and say hello to you in person. But that day has not come.
You'll want to say kumusta.
Oh, kumusta. That's in Tagalog?
Yeah, a Filipino. Tagalog is the base of Filipino. And it comes from Spanish, como está.
Oh, I think you told me that before. Yeah, because we talked about vámonos or vamos and became vamos.
Vamos,
to the Cowboys out west. Jimmy, thank you very much. I know we'll be seeing you in person shortly, so I look forward to seeing you next week for the Catholic Answers Conference.
Indeed, me too.
Well, that does it for us. I'll tell you again, there's a big sale over at shop.catholic.com on all digital media, and it goes on till midnight Sunday, Honolulu time. So that gives you the whole weekend to get your digital stuff over at shop.catholic.com. We'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live.